The flickering light above Amara's kitchen sink buzzed faintly, casting uneven shadows over a pile of unopened envelopes. She sat motionless at the small formica table, her slender hands clenched tightly around a half-filled cup of cold coffee. Her wide brown eyes, soft but hollow from sleepless nights, were fixed on a single piece of paper, another overdue hospital bill. Her mother's name was scrawled in bold at the top, followed by a red stamp that read, "Final Notice." Amara stared at it, as though sheer willpower might make it disappear. But it didn't. The numbers didn't change. The urgency didn't fade. The fear only grew heavier, curling around her chest like invisible chains. It wasn't just the money. It was the silence of the hospital room where her mother lay unconscious, breathing only with the help of machines. It was the blank expression of nurses who had stopped making eye contact. It was the feeling that time was slipping between her fingers, and she was powerless to hold on to it. Amara had tried everything. 3 jobs, 1 body, no sleep, waitressing overnight, cleaning offices at dawn, answering phones in a call center by afternoon. She'd sold her car and stopped buying groceries, borrowed from everyone she knew. Yet no matter how much she hustled, the numbers never went down. The hospital had given her 1 week, just 1, or they'd be forced to suspend care. And when care stopped, Amara knew what would come next. Her mother would die. The thought twisted in her stomach. A dull ache pressed against her ribs as she ran a hand through her long braided hair, pulling it tighter at the scalp, as if the pain might drown out the panic. But it didn't. She wanted to scream, to cry, but even tears had limits. Hers had dried up 2 nights ago, when the last of her mother's blood tests came back worse than expected. A knock at the door snapped her out of the spiral. It was late, nearly midnight. No one came by at this hour. Her heart skipped. She tiptoed across the room and opened the door just a crack. A tall man in a dark suit stood in the hallway, his hands clasped neatly before him. He looked out of place, like a Wall Street executive who'd turned wrong into the Bronx. "Miss Amara Brown?" he asked, his voice smooth and oddly emotionless. She nodded, suspicious. He handed her an envelope. "Mr. Ethan Whitmore requests your presence, tomorrow, 10 a.m. He believes he can be of assistance." Before she could ask anything, he turned and walked away. Amara stood frozen. She had never heard that name, but she knew it. Everyone did. Ethan Whitmore, the billionaire tech mogul, founder of Whitmore Dynamics, ruthless in business, elusive in the press, always alone, always in control. Why would a man like him send for someone like her? Amara shut the door and opened the envelope with trembling fingers. Inside was a sleek black card engraved in gold. Whitmore Tower, 10 a.m. Penthouse, confidential. She stared at it for a long time, unsure whether it was hope or doom she was holding. The next morning, the sky was the color of wet concrete. Amara stood outside the soaring glass structure of Whitmore Tower, her coat wrapped tightly around her thin frame. She didn't belong here. She knew that. People like her weren't supposed to walk through marble lobbies guarded by silent men in black. But she walked in anyway. The elevator ride was silent and smooth, except for her heart pounding. When the doors opened, the penthouse was more breathtaking than anything she had imagined. Floor-to-ceiling windows, dark marble floors, and silence thick enough to suffocate. And there he was, Ethan Whitmore. He stood tall and sharp in a perfectly tailored suit near the windows. His ice-blue eyes met hers, calm, unreadable, and impossibly cold. For a moment, he didn't speak, just watched her, studied her. Then he said like steel wrapped in silk, "I've read your situation, Miss Brown, and I have a solution." She blinked, unsure what to say. He took a step forward, closing the distance. But it comes with terms. And in that moment, Amara felt something shift in the air, like stepping too close to the edge of a cliff, only to find the ground crumbling beneath your feet. She didn't know it yet, but the offer he was about to make would change everything. Not just her future, but her heart. And if you've made it this far into Amara's story, maybe it's already tugged at your heart too. If it has, leave a thought in the comments, or hit that like button to let us know you're still with her. And if you're curious about where this road with Ethan Whitmore leads, you should follow this channel. Trust me, the most unexpected turns are just beginning. To be continued. The silence in Ethan Whitmore's penthouse wasn't just quiet. It was deliberate. Every surface gleamed with curated precision, from the obsidian marble to the sculptural light fixtures. Yet despite the grandeur, Amara couldn't shake the feeling that this place wasn't designed for comfort. It was made for control. Ethan stood by the window, his hands in the pockets of his black suit, framed by a skyline of steel and glass. He didn't look at her as he spoke. His gaze remained fixed on the city below, as if the lives of millions moving beneath them were somehow less interesting than the storm beginning to rise behind his calm exterior. "I've reviewed your case," he said finally. "Your mother's condition, the outstanding balance, the projected cost of long-term care." He turned then, slowly, and fixed those pale eyes on her. "You're in a corner with no doors." Amara swallowed hard, her throat dry. "So you brought me here to remind me of that?" A corner of his mouth curved upward, but it wasn't a smile. "I brought you here because I can offer you a door. One. Just one." He crossed the room with quiet authority and placed a sleek leather folder on the table between them. Her eyes dropped to it instinctively. The edges were sharp. "The paper is inside a thick envelope. It smelled faintly of ink and inevitability. I will pay your mother's medical debt in full," he said, "and I will continue to fund her care for as long as necessary." Amara's breath hitched. That sentence alone felt like a rope thrown to someone drowning. "But," he added, his tone cooling like a shutter falling over his features, "I want something in return." The rope twisted. "What?" she asked, trying to keep her voice even. "What could you possibly want from me?" His eyes didn't leave hers. "A child." The word hit like a slap. Amara stared at him, not understanding at first. Then, when she did, her body went rigid. "A child?" "My heir," he clarified. "A biological one." She stepped back. "You're joking." "I don't joke," Ethan said flatly. The distance between them didn't matter. His voice reached her like gravity, measured, inevitable. "But why me?" she asked. "You don't know me." "I've done my due diligence." He said it like she was a startup or a real estate deal. "You're healthy, intelligent, disciplined. You carry yourself with dignity despite your circumstances, and you have no significant genetic risks." Her cheeks flushed with disbelief. "You investigated me?" He gave a slight nod. "Of course I did." Amara shook her head, 1,000 emotions surging at once. Rage, confusion, insult, fear. "You're asking me to sell my body, my future, for a hospital bill." "I'm offering you a chance to save your mother," he corrected coolly, "and secure yourself financially for life. After the birth, you'll receive a final settlement. No further contact required." She stared at him, heart pounding. "That's monstrous." Ethan's expression didn't change. "It's transactional." "No," she said, voice cracking. "It's inhuman." There was a long pause, the tension wrapping around them like wire. Then, quietly, he asked. Would you rather watch her die? Amara felt like the floor had been pulled out from under her. The question wasn't cruel. It was surgical, clean, like everything about him. Her mind whirled with reasons to run. But her mother's face, tired, fading, tethered to machines, flashed behind her eyes like a warning she couldn't ignore. What happens if I say no? She whispered. Then I'll have my driver return you home, he said, and you'll be back where you started, with a life slowly slipping away, and a bill no one else would pay. She looked down at the contract. It was right there in front of her, a single signature away, from relief, from ruin. And if I say yes? She asked, her voice smaller now. His gaze sharpened. Then we begin, as soon as you're ready. Amara hesitated. And when the child is born? His tone turned mechanical. The agreement concludes. You'll be free to go. But the child will be mine. The words felt like a lock clicking shut. Ethan stepped closer, his voice dropping an octave. You have agency here, Amara. No one is forcing your hand. But I won't offer this again. His eyes flicked to the pen beside the folder. Her fingers hovered above it like they were moving through water. She didn't remember picking it up, only the scratch of ink on paper. Her name, Amara Brown, written in blue ink beneath a clause that tied her to a man she barely knew, for reasons she didn't yet understand. When she finally looked up, Ethan was already watching her. Not with triumph, not with glee, with something colder. Possession. Good, he said softly. Now it's real. The sun outside had started to sink behind the buildings, casting long shadows across the polished floor. And Amara realized it was no longer her desperation she had to fear. It was his. The ink had barely dried on her signature when the silence in the room deepened, becoming something different, heavier, charged, like the stillness before a summer storm. Ethan didn't smile. He didn't offer a handshake. He carefully closed the folder, then stood there momentarily, as if absorbing her decision into his marrow. Amara watched him, unsure of what came next. Every instinct in her body screamed that she had crossed a threshold she could never uncross. You'll remain here, he said quietly. My staff will prepare a room for you on the private level. Your belongings will be retrieved this evening. It took her a moment to find her voice. What if I want to go home first? Ethan's eyes flicked toward her, unreadable. There's nothing there you need. The sentence wasn't a question. It was a fact that somehow made her throat tighten more than any order could have. He moved past her unhurried but absolutely, pressing a discreet button near the door. Within seconds, a woman in a crisp black uniform appeared, tall, elegant, and expressionless. Ethan didn't introduce her. He didn't need to. She'll take you to your quarters. You'll be medically evaluated in the morning. The process must begin as soon as possible. Amara nodded numbly, then followed the woman down a long corridor lined with glass and silence. Her heels clicked against the marble floor like a clock ticking too loudly in a library. When they reached the private suite, the woman opened the door and stepped aside without a word. The room was beautiful, expansive, bathed in warm light. But it wasn't welcoming. The walls were cream, the sheets were high thread count Egyptian cotton, and the floor was lined with imported wood. There were no photos. No color, no hint of personality. Just like him. She set her bag on the edge of the bed and stood there momentarily, unsure if she was meant to wait. But the door had already shut behind her, and she was alone again. That night, sleep never came. Amara lay on the pristine bed, eyes wide, watching the ceiling shift as headlights from the city below painted fleeting silver shadows above her. She thought of her mother, fragile, unconscious, still tethered to hope by machines and wires. and she thought of him, Ethan Whitmore. He was more than just wealthy. He was mythic, the kind of man who could change stock markets by phone, who didn't just walk into a room, he bent it to his will. And now, she belonged to him, even if only for a time. She didn't know when she drifted off, but at some point, between fear and exhaustion, her body surrendered. And when she woke, it was to the sound of a soft knock on the door. This time, a different woman stood there, her features gentle, her voice low. "Mr. Whitmore would like to see you now." Amara blinked at the light filtering through the blinds. "Now?" "Yes, ma'am." She didn't ask why. She didn't need to. She dressed in silence. A soft black dress that had appeared in her closet overnight, tailored perfectly to her frame. She ran her fingers along the hem as she entered the hallway, wondering how many other women had worn these clothes before her, or if she was the first. The woman led her to a different part of the penthouse, past steel and glass offices, quiet sitting rooms, and through a pair of heavy oak doors that opened into a study. Ethan stood at the far end, pouring a dark amber liquid into a tumbler. His shirt was open at the collar, sleeves rolled to his forearms. A fire flickered in the hearth behind him, casting his shadow against the wall in tall, sharp lines. When he turned, his eyes met hers immediately. "You're early," he said. "I didn't know I had a time." He gestured to the chair opposite him. "Sit." She didn't move. His brows lifted slightly. "Would you prefer to stand?" "I'd prefer to understand." His jaw tightened briefly. Then he walked toward her, his steps slow but sure. He stopped just a breath away, and Amara caught the faintest scent of him. Cedar, spice, and something clean, like winter wind. "You already agreed to the terms," he said softly. "That doesn't mean I understand them." His eyes searched hers, and for a moment, something flickered there. Interest, maybe. Or amusement. She couldn't tell. "The procedure will begin tomorrow. Medical supervision. A fertility specialist. We do this on my schedule." "And what if it doesn't happen right away?" she asked. "Then we try again." The words were simple, clinical, but the implication beneath them curled hot and unfamiliar in her chest. "And you," she whispered, barely getting the words out. "Do you intend to be involved?" His gaze didn't falter. "Yes." Her breath hitched. Ethan's hand lifted, slowly, deliberately, and brushed a single strand of hair behind her ear. His fingers were warm, his touch feather-light, but she felt it to her spine. "This will not be cold," he said. "It will not be mechanical." Amara's eyes widened. "But this is a contract." His voice dropped. "Some things don't follow contracts." For a heartbeat, neither of them moved. The fire crackled softly. The city roared in the distance, and Amara realized that for all his control, all his steel and calculation, Ethan Whitmore was a man with hunger beneath the surface. Not just for legacy, but for something far more dangerous. And somehow, she had just become the thing he couldn't walk away from. The room he brought her to was unlike any space she'd ever been in. It didn't just speak of wealth. It whispered of power, restraint, and curated silence. The walls were lined with matte obsidian and framed abstract paintings, their swirls too deliberate to be random. A fireplace hummed low at the far end, casting flickering amber light over the smooth floors. But the bed that anchored the room, low, wide, cloaked in dark silk, seemed to drink in the dimness around it. Amara stood near the door, hands clasped tightly in front of her. Her breath was steady, but her pulse betrayed her, fluttering wildly beneath her skin. Ethan stepped inside behind her, his presence quiet but engulfing. He didn't speak at first. He walked toward the bar in the corner, poured 2 fingers of scotch, and sipped. Only then did he glance at her. "You don't have to be afraid," he said, his voice low, even. Her jaw tightened slightly. "I'm not afraid of you." He smiled faintly, and for the first time, it almost looked human. "You should be." She turned away, unsettled by the softness in his tone more than the threat in his words. "You said this wouldn't be cold," she said after a moment. "It won't be." Amara faced him. "Then what is it?" He walked closer. His steps were unhurried, but the space between them closed too fast. She could feel his heat before he even touched her. She hated that she noticed. "I don't take things I don't value," Ethan said quietly, "and I never rush the things I do." He reached out, his knuckles brushing the edge of her jaw. His touch was deliberate, slow, almost reverent. It startled her more than anything else could have. She didn't move, couldn't. His fingers slipped beneath her chin, lifting her gaze to his. "I want to know you," he said. "You want my body." His brow lifted slightly. "That, too. But I already own the contract. What I want now is your surrender." A sharp breath caught in her throat. He leaned in, and his lips brushed the shell of her ear. The kind that isn't written, the kind that can't be undone. She didn't answer. She couldn't trust her voice. Ethan stepped back slightly, his fingers trailing down her arm. "If you want to leave," he said, "you can. This is not coercion. But once you choose to stay, it becomes something else." Amara's thoughts raced, but looped back to one unshakable truth. Her mother, the machines, the quiet beep of a heart monitor in a hospital across the city, and Ethan, cold, calculated Ethan, was the only reason her mother was still breathing. "I'm already yours," she whispered. Ethan's eyes darkened, as if her words unlocked something he hadn't allowed himself to acknowledge. He took the glass from her hand, set it aside, then reached for her with both hands, this time not careful, not tentative. His fingers curled around her waist, guiding her toward him until their bodies were flush. She could feel the tension in him, restrained like a coiled wire. His hands slid over her hips, mapping the line of her back, memorizing. And when he kissed her, it wasn't possessive. It wasn't tender either. It was a claim, slow, deep, laced with a quiet danger. She trembled beneath his touch, but she didn't pull away. Instead, her hands moved of their own accord, curling into the fabric of his shirt, holding on to the one thing in the room that was real, even if terrifying. Ethan pulled her closer, his mouth lingering at the corner of hers. "Say stop," he whispered, but she didn't. Instead, she pressed her lips to his again. And this time, it wasn't about duty. It wasn't about the contract. It was about heat, about ache, about losing herself in a moment that had no roadmap. He lifted her gently, carried her across the room as though she weighed nothing, and laid her down on the silken sheets. The city lights from the windows spilled across the bed like liquid gold, casting long lines over the curves of her body, the rise of her chest, the sharp line of her throat. He hovered over her momentarily, eyes roaming as if committing her to memory. "You're not what I expected," he said softly. "Neither are you." His lips curved faintly. "Then we start here." And with that, the space between them disappeared. His hands were firm but patient, his mouth moving with a slow, consuming hunger that blurred the edges of thought. He undressed her like he was unwrapping something fragile, something he wasn't sure he deserved to touch. Her breath came in short, uneven waves as his touch deepened. Not rushed, not transactional. It was unlike anything she thought this arrangement would become. Every brush of his lips, every drag of his fingers, unraveled her by inches. She tried to hold on to the walls she'd built, but they were no match for the man who had built an empire with bare hands and now explored her body like it was the only territory he'd never conquered. When he finally entered her, it wasn't rough. It wasn't about power. It was something far more dangerous. It was quiet, intimate, undeniable. And when she cried out beneath him, part pain, part surrender, Ethan closed his eyes and pressed his forehead to hers. Mine. The word was never spoken, but she felt it everywhere, in his breath, in his hands. He held her afterward, like a man who had just touched something sacred and didn't know how to let go. And Amara, who had thought this would feel like a transaction, like survival, lay beneath him and realized she wasn't afraid. Not for what she had done, but of what she was starting to feel. Morning came in shades of gray and gold. The sky outside the penthouse windows was washed in the muted softness of early light, the city still humming beneath a veil of sleep. Amara stirred beneath the cool silk sheets, her body bare beneath their weight, her mind suspended between memory and awareness. The first thing she noticed was warmth. Not the kind from sunlight, but from the arm draped heavily over her waist. The slow, steady rhythm of a breath behind her. And then the voice. You didn't sleep much. Ethan. She blinked slowly, her eyes adjusting to the morning haze, and turned slightly to find him lying beside her, his head propped on one hand, bare-chested, his expression unreadable in the quiet light. I didn't expect to sleep at all, she said softly. He didn't answer immediately. His gaze swept across her face, then down to where the sheets barely covered the slope of her hip. When he looked back up, something in his expression had shifted slightly, less distant, less detached. I thought it would feel like a transaction, she added, her voice low after a moment. But it didn't. Ethan's thumb brushed absently along the inside of her wrist. It wasn't. There was something dangerous about how casually he said it. Like the lines they had drawn had already blurred. He wasn't interested in redrawing them. Amara pushed herself up slowly, pulling the sheet around her as she sat at the edge of the bed. Her body ached in unfamiliar ways, not just physically, but emotionally, like her soul had been peeled back layer by layer, and she hadn't realized until now how exposed she'd become. He sat up behind her, the mattress shifting beneath his weight. His hand brushed her shoulder, warm and possessive. You don't have to pretend this didn't happen. I'm not pretending, she said, glancing over her shoulder. I'm just thinking. His fingers traced a line from her shoulder down her back. About what? About how easily I became something I swore I'd never be. Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly. What do you mean? She met his gaze fully now, raw and unguarded. I've always fought for my dignity, for control. I didn't think I could give myself away like this, not even for my mother. But last night, I didn't fight you. He tilted his head slightly. You think surrender is weakness? She hesitated. I think I'm afraid of how much I needed it, she whispered. Ethan's fingers stilled on her spine. The silence between them stretched. Not uncomfortable, but sharp around the edges. Then, slowly, he leaned forward and kissed the back of her shoulder. It wasn't possessive. It wasn't even seductive. It was grounding. You didn't give yourself away, he murmured. You let me in. That's not the same thing. Amara looked down at her hands, unsure what to do with the words he had just given her. They weren't part of the contract. They weren't scripted. She stood slowly, wrapping the silk robe around her body. I need a shower, she said softly. Ethan didn't stop her. But when she disappeared into the bathroom and closed the door behind her, she knew he was still watching. Later that day, the air in the penthouse changed. The medical team arrived. Not loud, not intrusive, but clinical in their efficiency. A soft-spoken nurse took her vitals. A fertility specialist, stern, sharp-eyed, asked a string of emotionless questions. Ethan stood nearby, silent and still, offering neither comfort nor distance. She sat on the velvet chair in the private lounge afterward, dressed again in simple black, feeling like a shadow version of herself. "They'll begin hormone tracking tomorrow," Ethan said from the room's far end. "We'll proceed accordingly." His tone was back to business. She nodded, unsure whether to be grateful or wounded by the shift. "You can have the afternoon to yourself," he added, his gaze lingering. "Explore. Rest. Whatever you need." He turned to go. "Ethan," she said. He paused. She hesitated, then asked, "Is this all I'll be here for?" He turned back, brows slightly raised. "This arrangement," she continued, her voice steadier now, "is that all it is for you? A womb. A name on paper." His jaw flexed. Not a tick of discomfort, just calculation. He walked back toward her, slowly, until he stood close enough for her to see the faint scar near the edge of his jaw, barely visible beneath his stubble. "You asked me that yesterday," he said, "and I told you I don't do cold. But you're doing it now." He didn't flinch. Instead, he lowered himself to her level, his voice low, intense. "I don't know what this is yet, Amara. I didn't plan for it to be anything. I needed an heir. You needed a lifeline. But what happened last night?" His eyes lingered on her mouth. "That wasn't planned. And I don't take what I feel lightly." A tremor moved through her chest, quiet but undeniable. "Then what do we do?" she asked. Ethan's lips brushed the shell of her ear. "We move forward," he murmured, "and we see what becomes impossible to walk away from." That evening, she found a gift on the edge of her bed. Not jewelry, not perfume. A book, a worn, leather-bound collection of poetry, Maya Angelou. A note tucked between the pages in Ethan's precise handwriting. "You said you read to stay grounded. I wanted you to have something that touches the earth, even here." Amara ran her fingers along the edge of the paper, her breath catching unexpectedly. Maybe this wasn't cold. The most dangerous part of this wasn't the contract. Maybe it was the man who had just started learning how to feel, and the woman who feared she might never be able to unfeel him. Rain whispered down the penthouse's windows, like a lullaby for a city that never slept. Amara stood barefoot in the corner of the main living room, one hand curled around a mug of chamomile tea she hadn't touched. Her reflection stared back at her in the glass, hazy and uncertain. She'd been in Ethan Whitmore's world for 10 days. 10 days of quiet glances, of routine medical evaluations, of nights spent in a bed too vast, too soft, with a man who had begun to trace her like a language he hadn't yet mastered. And yet, the tension hadn't eased. It had only changed shape. He had kissed her again the night before, not hungrily, not with dominance, but with a strange, almost reverent stillness. It was as if he were trying to memorize her mouth, not claim it. It had left her more shaken than anything else. She didn't know what that kiss meant. She didn't know what any of this meant. The contract was clear. The terms were finite. But she couldn't quantify or reason away what grew between them. It threaded quietly through her days, coiling beneath conversations, blooming in silences. Ethan would brush his hand across her lower back when passing by. He would leave notes on her nightstand, Short, sometimes only a line or two, but always handwritten, always observant. You didn't eat your breakfast. Don't forget your scan at 2 p.m. You look tired today. Rest. A part of her feared those notes more than his touch, because they meant he was watching her. Not just her body, but her rhythm, and that was far more dangerous. That afternoon, Amara stepped out for the first time since her arrival. Ethan had arranged a driver, though she hadn't asked. He said nothing when she requested to visit the hospital. Just gave a nod. No argument, no condition. But as the town car pulled away from Whitmore Tower, she glanced behind, as if part of her expected him to appear, or worse, to stop her. He didn't. The hospital smelled like antiseptic and overuse. Bright lights hummed overhead, too white, too sharp. Her mother lay just as she remembered, pale, still, cocooned in wires and rhythmic beeping. The machines breathed for her now. Amara sat beside her, fingers laced through her mother's fragile ones, forehead pressed to the edge of the bed. "I'm still me," she whispered, "but I'm not sure for how long." The words fell into the quiet like water into a well. She didn't cry, not anymore. Grief, when slow, becomes a kind of companion, one you learn to carry. When she returned to the penthouse, dusk had already crept into the edges of the sky. The moment she stepped inside, she felt that subtle shift in the atmosphere, like static before a storm. Ethan was waiting for her. He stood by the fireplace, a glass of wine untouched in his hand, his tie loosened but not removed. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes were cold. "You left without telling me." She closed the door behind her, calm but cautious. "I didn't think I needed permission." "You don't," he said, voice flat, "but I expected respect." Amara stepped forward, her chin lifted. "Respect doesn't require announcing every breath I take." He took a long moment to study her. "You're not a prisoner here. Then stop acting like I'm one." The silence that followed was razor sharp. Ethan exhaled slowly, then set his glass down with a deliberate clink. "Do you think I haven't already surrendered enough control to let you in here? In this space?" His voice wasn't raised but crackled beneath the surface, like heat beneath ice. "This wasn't part of my life. Not before you." Amara's throat tightened. "And what exactly am I in your life, Ethan? An asset? A risk? A liability with nice skin?" He stepped closer, the muscles in his jaw flexing. "You're the mother of my child." "No," she said quietly. "Not yet. And you don't get to own me just because I agreed to give you something." His hands curled into fists at his sides. It was supposed to be simple. She laughed once, dry, broken. "Then maybe you shouldn't have kissed me like I was the only real thing in your life." His breath caught, just for a second. It was the first crack she'd ever seen in his composure. "I didn't ask to feel anything," he said. "Neither did I." The air between them pulsed with something heavy and unspoken. Amara turned to leave the room, but his voice stopped her at the threshold. "Don't walk away from me, Amara." She didn't turn back. "If you want me to stay, then stop treating me like an equation you're trying to solve." And then she was gone. Her footsteps soft against the marble, but their echo louder than any door slammed shut. Later that night, she found another note on her nightstand. This one was different. The handwriting is less sharp. The ink smudged slightly, as if he'd written it and hesitated before leaving it behind. "Control was all I had before you walked in. Now I'm learning how to lose it, and I'm unsure who I'll be on the other side. E." She sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, the paper held loosely in her hand, her heart unbearably still. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't a confession, but it was the truth. And maybe that was the only thing more dangerous than desire, because desire can be ignored. But truth demands change. The next morning, the world outside was drenched in soft mist. A delicate veil of rain blurred the skyline, dulling the city's edges into watercolor gray. Amara stood by the window in a robe she hadn't realized was his, masculine, oversized, and warm in a way that confused her. She wrapped it tighter around herself, as if it might hold her together, even as everything else felt like it was quietly falling apart. She hadn't spoken to Ethan since the argument the night before. He hadn't knocked and hadn't sent a note, but she felt him everywhere. In the way the air shifted when she walked through the penthouse, in the heat that lingered on the sheets. Silence seemed to carry weight now, as if his absence was louder than his presence had ever been. She didn't know what to do with that. She didn't know what to do with him. She had built her life on distance, measured choices, survival. But Ethan Whitmore didn't live in measurements. He existed in extremes. Everything he touched was either completely his or completely irrelevant. And now, she was somewhere in between. And that space was unbearable. The doctor came mid-morning, a quiet woman with practiced hands and a clipboard full of numbers. Amara submitted herself to the tests, the scans, and the blood work without protest. She answered questions about her sleep, temperature, and last cycle. She lay on the cold leather exam table, with her knees drawn up, eyes fixed on the ceiling, while the sonographer moved the wand across her abdomen. "You're ovulating," the doctor said after a moment. Amara blinked. "Already?" The woman nodded. "Everything's aligning faster than expected." His timing was precise. Of course it was. Ethan didn't leave anything to chance. She was given a schedule, a chart, and a dosage plan. That afternoon, Ethan reappeared. Not in her room, not with a letter, but in the hallway, just as she was returning from the clinic. He was in a dark sweater, no jacket, barefoot on the marble floor, as if he hadn't planned to see anyone. His eyes met hers, unreadable, cool. They stood in silence for several long seconds. Then he said quietly, "I didn't sleep either." She looked away. He stepped forward. "The doctor gave me the report." "Of course she did," Amara murmured. "We can proceed tonight." Her chest tightened. "That's what you want?" "I thought it was what we agreed to." Amara's breath caught. "Do you believe this is still mutual?" His jaw clenched. "You signed the contract. I signed to save my mother, Ethan, not to become a shadow of myself whenever you forget I'm not just a piece of paper." He didn't respond immediately. His posture stiffened, one shoulder rising, the most minor tick in his cheek betraying emotion he hadn't planned to show. Then, softly, "I forget nothing about you." He took a step closer. She didn't move. "I remember how your fingers trembled when you signed your name," he said. "I remember how your eyes turned when I first kissed you. I remember you didn't flinch, not once, not even when you should have." Her throat tightened. "Then why does it feel like I'm the only one breaking?" Ethan's hand almost instinctively moved toward her, then stopped midair. "Because you still believe this ends." Amara's breath caught in her chest. "What if it doesn't?" he said. "What if this is only the beginning?" She didn't have an answer for that. Because some part of her, a part she hadn't admitted out loud, had started to want exactly that. And that was the most terrifying truth of all. That night, the air inside the penthouse was too still. Dinner arrived on silver trays. Neither of them ate. He met her in the bedroom without ceremony. No commands, no promises. Just two people standing at the edge of a moment they had once agreed would be clinical, and now couldn't seem to define. Ethan moved first. He stepped close, one hand brushing the curve of her waist, the other slipping into the nape of her neck. His touch was firmer tonight, more certain, not of ownership, but of intention. "I'm not here because of the contract," he murmured against her temple. "I know," she whispered back. His mouth found hers then, slow, coaxing, reverent. She opened beneath him, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. He laid her down gently, his hands memorizing her curves like he'd been dreaming of them. His fingers traced the lines of her ribs, the slope of her thighs, and the hollow beneath her collarbone. She gasped when his lips met the sensitive skin below her ear. "You feel like something I didn't know I was missing," he whispered. Her breath trembled. "Don't say that unless you mean it." He paused, eyes burning into hers. "I've never said anything I didn't mean." And when he entered her, she felt it. Not just the physical depth of him, but the emotional shift between them. The way his breath stuttered, the way his hands clutched her was tighter than before. He whispered her name like it was the first word he ever learned. It wasn't about producing an heir. It wasn't about settling a debt. It was about two people who were supposed to remain strangers and were instead becoming something dangerously close to permanent. He moved inside her slowly, achingly, until she could no longer tell where she ended and he began. Her fingers gripped his back, her mouth gasped against his throat, and when she came undone beneath him, it wasn't in silence. It was in his name, Ethan. And when it was over, when the room had stilled and his heartbeat thundered in her ear, he whispered something into the hollow of her neck. She wasn't sure if she imagined it, but it sounded like, "Don't leave." So she didn't. Not yet. Not tonight. The morning after was unusually quiet. Not the stillness of absence, but of anticipation. Thick, unsaid, hovering in the air like mist clinging to the skin. The city roared faintly beyond the windows, indifferent and relentless. But inside the penthouse, time moved more slowly, wrapped in the weight of everything unspoken. Amara awoke first. She lay on her side, the silk sheets tangled around her hips, Ethan's arm resting heavily across her waist. His breath was steady against the back of her neck, slow and warm, and his body pressed against hers in a way that suggested he hadn't just fallen asleep beside her. He had stayed and chosen to stay. She stared at their faint reflection on the glass wall across the room. Two figures tangled in intimacy, in compromise, in something that no longer belonged to either contract or circumstance. And yet, she felt it again. That low, dull ache in her chest. Longing, maybe, or worse, attachment. Her fingers slid over the back of his hand, her skin tingling where their bodies met. She wanted to move, but part of her feared waking him. Not because she was afraid of him, but she was scared of what she might see in his eyes when he opened them. Regret, detachment, or something far more dangerous, something that mirrored her confusion. When Ethan finally stirred, it was subtle. A shift in breath, the soft flex of muscle beneath her spine. Then his voice was deep and rough with sleep. "You're still here." She didn't turn around. "Was I supposed to leave?" "No." He paused. "But I thought you might." "I almost did." He pulled her closer. "Why didn't you?" Her eyes fluttered shut. "It would have felt like running from something I couldn't name." Ethan pressed his mouth to her shoulder. "It's not weakness, you know. Not knowing." She turned to face him, slowly, their faces just inches apart. His eyes were clear now, fully awake, scanning her like she was still a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. "I'm scared," she admitted. "Of me?" "No," she whispered. "Of us. Of what this is becoming." Ethan exhaled. "You're not the only one." For a moment, neither of them moved. Something about the softness of his gaze undid her more than his touch ever had. She searched his face, not for answers, but for sincerity. "What happens after?" she asked. He didn't pretend not to understand. "I don't know," he said truthfully. This wasn't supposed to have an after. Her chest tightened, but now it might. He nodded once, slowly. Yes. That afternoon, Ethan was pulled into a conference call. Business moved on, regardless of emotion. Amara remained in the penthouse alone, the silence wrapping around her like a second skin. She wandered into the library, a room she had only glanced at before, and sank into the oversized leather chair in the corner. A heavy rain began to fall outside, muffling the sounds of the city. She reached for a book, not even reading the title, and let the sound of pages turning lull her into calm. But the peace didn't last long. A knock at the door, sharp, unexpected, made her sit upright. It wasn't staff. They never knocked. She crossed the living room cautiously and opened the door only slightly. A woman stood on the other side, tall, blonde, impeccably dressed. Her features were elegant in the way that came with money, not kindness. And her eyes held no softness at all. "I'm looking for Ethan," the woman said. Her tone clipped. Amara didn't respond at first. The woman's lips curled into something halfway between amusement and disdain. "You must be her." "Her?" Amara repeated stiffly. "The one he's hiding." She tilted her head. "You're not what I expected." Before Amara could reply, Ethan appeared. He didn't speak. He didn't touch her. He stepped between them, like a wall rising from the ground. "Vivian," he said, his voice a full octave colder than usual. "This isn't your place." "You've always said that, Ethan." Her smile was brittle. "And yet here I am. I didn't invite you. You never do." Her eyes flicked past him, back to Amara. "But you always collect things you don't understand." "Leave," he said, sharper now. Vivian gave a slight, mocking nod. "Of course. But you might want to let your pet know how this ends. It's not the first time you've played God." She turned and disappeared down the hall without another word. Ethan shut the door behind her, then stood still, his back to Amara. Amara swallowed the dryness in her throat. Who was she? He didn't answer. Ethan. He turned slowly. Someone who used to matter, and someone who thought she still does. Amara's voice softened. What did she mean? He met her eyes. That I ruin things I touch. Her heart clenched. Is that what you're doing to me? She asked. His jaw worked, but no words came. I need to know, she continued, stepping closer, because I'm starting to forget where you end and I begin. He looked at her, and something broke in his expression. Not anger, not guilt, but grief. I don't know how to be what you need, he said. I didn't ask you to be anything, she whispered. I just need to know if I'm real to you. His hand lifted slowly, brushing her cheek. You're the only real thing in this place. And just like that, her heart broke in a way that wasn't pain, but release. Because no matter how careful they had been, no matter how many rules they'd built around this, they had already lost control of the boundaries, of the contract, of themselves. And maybe, just maybe, that was the point. The night after Vivian's unexpected arrival, something in Ethan changed. It wasn't obvious. He still moved with that quiet control, pressed his morning coffee into her hands like clockwork, and asked her if she had slept, even when he didn't. But there was a silence now that wasn't just quiet. It was haunted, and Amara felt it whenever he looked at her. like she might disappear. She didn't ask more about Vivian. She didn't need to. Some names don't need to be spoken to leave a scar. But the ache was subtle, curling at the edges of her breath. Because Vivian hadn't just been a warning. She had been a mirror, a shadow of what Amara herself might become, given enough time and abandonment. She didn't want to be another woman Ethan left behind, and yet, the fear of it sat heavy in her chest, especially when he pulled away, not physically, but emotionally. The Ethan who once reached for her during breakfast now remained seated. The man who once kissed her with reverence now only offered silence between glances. She wasn't sure if he was protecting her or preparing to let her go. Either way, it hurt. 3 days passed like a quiet unraveling. The ovulation window was closing. The doctor's schedule had been marked, tracked, and crossed off. But neither of them had returned to that bedroom. Not for that reason. Not since the night he whispered, "Don't leave." Not since everything shifted. Ethan buried himself in meetings. He stayed at the office longer. He returned later, worn and more guarded. And when he did come home, he didn't go to her. Amara found herself wandering the penthouse like a ghost of her own life. One evening, she sat at the piano, a grand black instrument tucked against a far window wall. She'd never seen Ethan play it, but the keys were warm to the touch, like someone had. She let her fingers drift across the ivory, unsure at first, then steadier. She hadn't played in years, but the music came anyway, fragile, gentle, something like memory. When the final note faded, she saw him standing in the doorway, watching her. "You play," he said quietly. She nodded. "I used to." "Church choir." "My mom saved 3 months' pay for my first lesson." Ethan stepped closer. The firelight flickered across his face, casting gold shadows across the sharp planes of his jaw. "I never knew that about you," he said. "You never asked." A pause. Then, "That's not true." She tilted her head, searching his expression. "Isn't it? I've been asking since the first day. I just never had the right words." He sat beside her on the bench, his thigh brushing hers. The silence between them wasn't empty anymore. It was full of 1,000 things they hadn't said. "Vivian wasn't just a woman I dated," he said finally, voice low. "She was part of something darker, something that came from ambition without conscience." Amara said nothing. She let him speak. She wanted power more than she wanted love. And I wanted control more than I wanted truth. We made a good team for a while, until we didn't. Until someone got hurt. "Who?" Amara asked gently. His jaw flexed. "Someone who didn't deserve it." She studied the side of his face, the rigid line of his shoulders. "And now you think that's who you are?" "I think it's who I was." She hesitated. "And who are you now?" He didn't answer right away, but when he turned to her, his eyes were no longer distant. "They say grief changes people. So does love. But I think the most dangerous change comes from hope. The hope that maybe you won't destroy what matters this time." Amara's heart stilled. "Am I that thing?" Ethan reached up, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear, his hand lingering against her cheek. "You're not a thing," he whispered. "You're a beginning I never planned for." Her eyes burned. "Then stop shutting me out. Let me in." "I'm not afraid of your past, Ethan, but I am afraid of your silence." He looked down for a moment, as if weighing something inside him. Then he said, "There's something I need to show you." She followed him without question, barefoot across the marble floors, past doors she hadn't opened. He stopped before a narrow, nondescript room at the end of a quiet corridor. When he opened the door, the air inside was different. Warmer, lived in, not sterile like the rest of his curated life. It was a nursery, unfinished, a crib, still in its box, paint samples on the wall, books are stacked on the floor, a rocking chair facing a blank canvas. Amara turned slowly, eyes wide. "You were building this?" Ethan nodded once. "I started the day you signed the contract." Her hand touched the edge of the crib box. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I was afraid that if you saw it, you'd realize how deep I was already in." Amara stepped into the room fully, her breath catching. It was the first real glimpse she'd had into his heart. Not just his plans, control and quiet hope. "You wanted this," she whispered. "I wanted you," he said. The words lingered in the room like music. She turned to him, tears threatening. "And if it doesn't happen? If I don't get pregnant?" His eyes never left hers. "Then I still want you." She swallowed. "Even without the child?" "Especially without the child," he said. She stepped into his arms, resting her head against his chest. His hand cradled the back of her head, holding her as if she were made of something fragile and irreplaceable. And in that moment, beneath the weight of everything they'd been through, everything still awaited ahead. She believed him. Not because it was easy, but because he had finally given her the one thing she needed most. His truth. It wasn't love. Not yet. But it was dangerously close. Something with weight, heat, and memory. Something that bloomed in silence and bled into moments when neither of them was watching. It lived in the way Ethan now lingered in the mornings. Coffee untouched, as he watched Amara move through the room barefoot. It breathed in the hush between their conversations, how his fingers found hers across the couch without thinking. It whispered in the sound of her laughter, rare, light, like a string being plucked for the first time in years, and in the way he paused when he heard it, as though part of him couldn't believe it came from her. And Amara, she was falling, not with speed, not recklessly, but in the quiet, terrifying way a person does when they've run out of reasons to guard their heart. And she didn't know how to stop. The days that followed fell into a rhythm she hadn't expected. Ethan began coming home earlier. Sometimes he brought wine. Other times, it was books, stories, or simply his presence. Unarmored, uninterested in pretending he didn't care. One night, he sat beside her on the floor, leaning against the couch, watching the fire. His arm brushed hers, casual but intentional. "I don't remember the last time I came home for something other than sleep," he murmured. She glanced over. "Then what changed?" He looked at her. "You're here." Her breath caught. It would have been easier to look away. But she didn't. "You say things like that," she whispered. "And I want to believe them." "You can." "Can I?" she asked softly. "Or is this just comfort disguised as permanence?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached over and took her hand. Not with urgency, not with heat, but with something steady, human. "Sometimes I wish I'd met you before I had anything to lose," he said. "Why? Because then you'd know me without the titles, without the money, without the stories people tell about me when I'm not in the room." Amara tilted her head, her voice barely audible. "And what would I have seen?" He gave her a small smile. Someone who wanted to build something real. A silence settled between them. Not cold, but sacred. It was during one of those quiet mornings, days after the nursery had been revealed, that the first sign came. Amara had woken up with a strange nausea. Nothing alarming, just a dull queasiness that clung to her for hours. She didn't mention it to Ethan at first. It felt too early, too delicate, like naming it aloud might somehow break whatever spell they'd fallen into. But later, when sitting at the kitchen island with a cup of ginger tea and toast she hadn't touched, Ethan came in, eyes narrowing at her pale face. "You're not eating." She gave a weak smile. "Just not hungry." He walked around and studied her more closely. "You look off." "Thanks," she said dryly. He didn't smile. Instead, he reached out and touched her forehead. His fingers were gentle but precise, searching for heat, tension, for anything out of place. "You feel warm." "I'm fine, Ethan," she said, trying to dismiss it. "It's probably nothing." But he didn't let it go. 2 hours later, the doctor was in the penthouse. "I want to run a full panel," she said after the exam. "Given the timeline, it's possible you're reacting hormonally." Amara's pulse quickened. "You mean?" The doctor nodded. "It's too early for confirmation. But there are signs." Ethan stood to the side, silent, still. But Amara could feel the storm gathering beneath his stillness. When the doctor finally left, they were alone again. She turned to him, unsure what she'd find in his face. Expectation? Fear? Relief? But what she saw instead unraveled her entirely. It was awe. He walked toward her slowly, then stopped, uncertain. "Say something," she whispered. He shook his head, voice rough. "I don't want to say the wrong thing." "There is no wrong thing," she said, stepping closer. "Just tell me what you feel." He took a shaky breath, like the world just opened beneath my feet. And instead of falling, I finally found something to stand on. Her eyes filled. She reached for him, and he folded her into his arms without hesitation. They stood there for a long time, wrapped in the possibility of everything they never planned to want. And for once, neither of them spoke. Because some things, some beginnings are too sacred for words. Later that night, Ethan stood at the window while Amara rested in bed, curled beneath the covers, her hand resting gently on her abdomen. He watched the skyline. Lights flickered like stars across steel and glass. The city was loud, alive, but there was only stillness in this room. He hadn't told her yet that 2 years ago, a woman he'd trusted had tried to carry his child, only to disappear with the money halfway through. That he'd spent months questioning his judgment, his worth, wondering if he would ever try again. And then Amara had walked into his life, not seeking wealth, not chasing power, but willing to give of herself for love of someone else, her mother. And now she lay there, carrying a part of him he hadn't dared to hope for. He didn't say it aloud, but in his heart, he already knew. It was no longer about the contract, or the baby, or even the promise of legacy. It was about her. It had always been about her. And this time, he wouldn't run. The confirmation came 3 days later, in a small white envelope, with a seismic shift inside it. Amara held the paper with trembling fingers, reading the words repeatedly, as if they might change the longer she stared at them. But they didn't. They held steady, quiet, unwavering, undeniable. She was pregnant. It was real. She sat on the edge of the bed, the early morning light draping the room in a gentle haze. Her heartbeat pulsed in her ears, soft and strange, like a song she didn't yet know how to dance to. There was no fanfare, no dramatic revelation, just stillness. And in that stillness, the truth felt heavier than she imagined. It was a quiet miracle, and a quiet terror. Her hand drifted to her belly, almost in disbelief. Life, Ethan's life was growing inside her. But more than that, it was theirs now. Not a transaction, not a contract. Something organic, something sacred. She heard the door open behind her, his footsteps careful as they approached. Amara. She turned slowly. Their eyes met, and before she could speak, even form the words, Ethan was already there, kneeling before her, his hands gently holding hers, his eyes locked on hers as if the world had narrowed to this moment. "You already know," she whispered. He nodded. "I saw the doctor's message." She exhaled. "It feels unreal." Ethan looked at her stomach. Then, with the lightest, most reverent touch, he placed his palm just above her navel. "It's not unreal," he murmured. "It's everything I didn't dare hope for." Her throat tightened. "Are you scared?" He met her gaze again, terrified. She laughed softly, relief laced with emotion. "Good. Me too. But I want this," he added, firmer now. "Not just the child. I want all of it. You. Us." She studied him, searching for doubt, but there was none. Only sincerity. Only that quiet awe hadn't left him since the day the possibility first stirred between them. And maybe that's when she knew. They weren't pretending anymore. In the days that followed, something in their lives softened. Ethan began rearranging his schedule, often coming home early and carving out time between meetings to sit beside her. They'd talk about everything and nothing, her cravings, her childhood, his fears about fatherhood. He told her things he'd never spoken aloud. About the father he barely remembered, the years of loneliness disguised by achievement, the women who had entered his life wanting the empire, but never the man. "You're different," he said one night, his voice low as they lay side by side in the dark. "Because I never asked for any of this?" "No," he said gently, "because you never needed it. You only ever asked for respect, and gave me honesty in return." She turned her face toward him, her voice soft. "You think that's rare? In my world?" he said. "It's nearly extinct, but perfection, even when it comes quietly, never lasts." It was a rainy Tuesday afternoon when the first fracture appeared. Amara had just returned from a routine prenatal checkup. The staff had offered to drive her, but she insisted on going alone. She liked the city's silence from the backseat of a cab, the anonymity of moving through New York without anyone knowing who she was. Just a woman in oversized sunglasses, carrying a secret no one else could see. She stepped into the penthouse, shaking the rain from her coat, only to stop at the sound of voices. Ethan was in his office. The door was open, and someone else was with him. "You're being reckless, Ethan. You think you found love in a woman you hired?" It was a woman's voice, sharp, familiar. "Vivian." Amara froze, just outside the threshold. "This has nothing to do with you," Ethan replied. His tone clipped, colder than Amara had ever heard. "You're bringing a child into the world with her," Vivian hissed. "And what? You think that makes her family now?" "She already is." A silence. Then Vivian laughed bitterly. "You're still the same. You want to rewrite your past by pretending this one will be different." "I'm not pretending," he said. "I'm choosing." "Then, choose carefully," she warned. "Because women like her don't stay." Amara stepped back. The words sliced through her like winter wind. Not because they were true, but she feared they might be because she hadn't acknowledged it in some part of her heart until now. She didn't confront him that night. She didn't tell him she'd heard. Instead, she watched him from across the dinner table. His sleeves rolled up, a soft crease between his brows, as he asked about her checkup. He poured her water, offered her an extra cushion for her back, and even made her laugh when he pretended to burn the bread. But something was trembling beneath her skin now. A crack. A question. Would she always be someone others looked at and saw less? Would she ever truly belong in his world? She excused herself early and retreated to the guest room instead of their shared one. Ethan didn't knock. He gave her space. And somehow, that stung even more. Because it meant he sensed the distance. But maybe he didn't know how to bridge it. At 3 a.m., she stood by the window, arms wrapped around herself as the city lights flickered like secrets. She wasn't a fool. She knew love came with shadows, and that when powerful men gave their hearts, the world didn't applaud, it questioned. But still, she wasn't built to shrink. She had made peace with uncertainty before. She had held her mother's hand through illness, endured nights of hunger and mornings of doubt. She had survived worse storms than this. But this time, the risk was different. Because now, she wasn't only protecting herself. She was protecting something growing within her. And she wasn't sure if Ethan, despite all his promises, was ready to fight for it the way she needed him to. By morning, she was gone. No note, no drama, just silence and space, and a heart too full of hope to be broken, but too proud to be ignored. Ethan woke to silence, not the comforting kind, the kind wrapped in the rustle of sheets, the soft sound of Amara breathing beside him. No. This silence was hollow. Hollow in a way that made the hairs on the back of his neck rise before he even opened his eyes. The room was cold. Her side of the bed was untouched, and something in his chest immediately tightened. He sat up, called her name. Nothing. The walk down the hallway felt longer than it ever had. He checked the kitchen, the sunroom, and the library. No signs of her, no coat on the hook, no shoes by the door. She was gone. He stood in the middle of the living room, heart pounding, and told himself to stay calm. But the calm wouldn't come, because Amara didn't disappear. Not without reason, not without a goodbye, unless he had pushed her too far, unless she had finally reached her limit and slipped out quietly the way she had entered his life, on her terms. It took an hour for his assistant to confirm what he already feared. She had canceled all her upcoming appointments and left her phone behind, and instructed the building staff not to disclose her location if he came asking about it, which he did. Twice. Ethan stared at the blank screen of her phone for a long time, willing it to light up. It was as if her absence was just a momentary thing, a misunderstanding. As if she'd walk back through the door at any minute, laughing softly, telling him it was just a walk, just some air. But the longer the silence stretched, the deeper the ache grew. And then it hit him. How little he knew where she would go when she needed space. She had always been the one stepping into his world. But now, stripped of that context, he realized how fragile everything between them truly was. It became vulnerable when it crossed the threshold from contract to connection, and how badly he had failed to protect that connection when she needed it most. Amara stood on the porch of a small townhouse on the edge of Harlem, one hand pressed against her lower belly as she stared at the familiar green door. It wasn't much, but it was the place she'd grown up. Her Aunt Ruth answered, still wearing her robe and a half-tied scarf around her hair. She blinked once at the sight of Amara, then opened her arms without a word. The hug was quiet, fierce, and for the first time in days, Amara allowed herself to cry. The next few hours blurred. Tea, blankets, questions answered only in half-truths. Ruth didn't push. She never had. She sat beside Amara on the couch and let her speak when ready. "I left him," Amara said at last. Ruth nodded slowly. "Because you don't love him?" "No." Amara's voice cracked. "Because I do." Ruth sipped her tea. And what exactly are you running from, child? Amara looked down. His world, his past, the way people look at me and see someone temporary. And how does he look at you? Like he's learning how to breathe again. Then maybe, Ruth said gently, it's not his eyes you're afraid of. Maybe it's your reflection in them. Amara stilled. The words hit harder than expected, because deep down, she knew the truth wasn't in Ethan's failures alone. It was in her fear of becoming someone defined by a man, of losing herself in a life she hadn't chosen, only fallen into. But had she fallen? Or had she leapt? And if she had leapt, was it so wrong to want someone to catch her? The next evening, Ethan sat alone in the nursery. The mobile above the crib box spun gently from the breeze, slipping through the window. The room smelled of cedar and new beginnings. And yet, everything felt half alive, unfinished, like him. He was holding a small photograph. It was a printout from the doctor's office. Amara's ultrasound from her first visit. He'd kept it in his desk drawer for weeks. Now he stared at the grainy image, wondering how something so small could rearrange every part of his soul. He remembered what Vivian had said. Women like her don't stay. But she had stayed. Longer than she should have. And if she had walked away now, it wasn't because she was weak. It was because he hadn't made her feel safe. Loved, yes. Desired, endlessly. But safe? Maybe not. He had let her stand alone in a room where people like Vivian looked at her and saw a threat instead of a future. He had tried to protect her by staying silent, by not bringing more chaos into her life. But silence wasn't protection. It was distance. And distance, for someone like Amara, who had always carried the weight of the world alone, must have felt like abandonment. On the third morning, Ruth found Amara on the porch steps, wrapped in a shawl, her tea untouched. "You can stay as long as you need," she said. "I know," Amara replied, "but I think I need to go back." Ruth smiled softly. "Not for him, I hope." Amara shook her head. "For me. Because if this love was going to break her, she wanted it to do so honestly. Not through running, not through fear. She hadn't fought through poverty, grief, and loneliness to fold when something real knocked at her door. She had always been stronger than her circumstances. And now, she would be stronger than her doubts. When she walked back into the penthouse late that evening, Ethan was precisely where she'd left him, at the window, staring out at a city that never once gave him what he truly wanted. Until her. He turned at the sound of her footsteps, and for a moment, neither of them moved. "I thought I'd lost you," he said quietly. "You almost did." His breath hitched. "I'm sorry." She walked toward him slowly. "I heard what Vivian said." "I know," he said, shame blooming in his expression. "But that's not why I left." He looked up. "I left," she said, "because I needed to know that I hadn't become someone who only existed in your world." His voice dropped. "You never were." Amara reached him now, her hands cool against his chest. "Then show me. Build something with me. Not around me." "I will," he whispered. She rested her head against him. "Then I'm not going anywhere." The silence returned. But this time, it held no threat, only peace, and a beginning rewritten, not in contracts, bloodlines, or legacy, but in the quiet decision to stay, together. The first snowfall arrived early that year, blanketing the city in a hush that made even New York feel gentle. From the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse, Amara stood watching the flakes drift slowly downward, her fingertips resting on the swell of her stomach, now more prominent, more certain. It had become a ritual, these quiet mornings. Her body moves more slowly, and the air is thick with winter and memory. And beside her, Ethan had begun his ritual, waking up earlier to watch her stand there, unknowing, like she was carved from dusk and wonder. That morning, he didn't say a word. He wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin lightly on her shoulder. His warmth draped across her back like a vow. "Do you remember?" he said, voice soft. "The first time you saw snow?" Amara smiled faintly. "Chicago. I was 6. It melted on my mittens, and I cried because I thought it had died in my hands." Ethan kissed the spot just beneath her ear. "You still mourn beautiful things too easily, and you still mistake awareness for sadness," she whispered. A pause. "I don't want this to melt," he said suddenly, eyes fixed on the snow-covered city. "What we're building. I want it to stay." Amara turned slowly, her dark eyes steady on his. "Then stop waiting for it to disappear. Stop bracing for loss." There it was again. Her clarity. The way she named his fears without judgment. And yet, he didn't flinch. He was learning not to. The days blurred into weeks, and with them came unexpected tenderness. Ethan, who once thought parenting would be handled through hired help and polished routines, now obsessively researched bassinets at 3 a.m., sending Amara links and pictures like a teenager choosing his first car. He attended every doctor's appointment, sitting beside her with his hand locked around hers, as if the grip could ward off anything unspoken. And Amara, once fiercely independent, began allowing herself to lean, not out of weakness, but out of choice. The deeper the baby grew within her, the more she softened into the life around her. Still, not everything was effortless. The press had caught wind of their relationship, slowly, but loud enough to spark murmurs. Photographs surfaced. Headlines whispered, "mystery woman," and speculated on motives. Ethan's advisors were polite, but relentless. "She has no public profile," they said. "No history of involvement with charitable initiatives. Are you sure this isn't emotional impulse?" Ethan fired 2 of them before lunch, but it was the gala that fractured the illusion of peace. It was a fundraiser he had promised to attend months before meeting Amara. A high society event with crystal chandeliers, vintage champagne, and the type of tailored smiles that left teeth marks on your soul. Amara was hesitant. "Your world isn't exactly known for subtle welcomes," she said, adjusting the diamond pin on her dress. One Ethan had gifted her just days before, insisting that if she walked into a room of wolves, she should at least walk in armored. "You're not the one who needs to be careful," he said, his voice low as he helped zip her dress. "They are." And for a while, everything seemed fine. Until Vivienne arrived. She hadn't been on the guest list, but influence didn't require invitations in circles like theirs. She approached slowly, glass in hand, eyes predatory beneath her lashes. The crowd parted, instinctively aware that a scene was about to be set. My, Vivienne said, her voice syrupy. "You do clean up nicely." Amara gave her a tight smile. "That's the thing about dignity. It doesn't need embellishment." Vivienne smirked. "And that's the thing about fantasy. It shatters in the light." Ethan stepped in then, jaw tight, eyes dark. "Vivienne, not tonight." But Amara touched his arm lightly. "It's all right." She turned back to Vivienne, her voice calm but piercing. "You think I don't belong here because I wasn't born into privilege, because I didn't come gift-wrapped in pedigree and PR. But I've watched men like you admire become hollow. And I've watched women like me rise while others dismissed us." Vivienne's smile faltered. Amara stepped closer, her voice dropping low. "The difference between us isn't class. It's courage. And I've spent a lifetime surviving rooms colder than this." The silence that followed was seismic. Ethan took her hand, and in that moment, the power dynamic shifted, not through status, but presence. Amara didn't need anyone to declare her worthy. She was. Back at the penthouse, the adrenaline faded into exhaustion. Ethan sat beside her, wordless, running his thumb across her knuckles as if anchoring her to this new world they were shaping. "Was I too much?" she asked suddenly. He looked at her, genuinely confused. "You weren't enough. You were exactly right." She exhaled, then leaned her head against his shoulder. "It's not easy, Ethan. I know. They'll keep coming, doubting, trying to pull this apart." He nodded. "Let them." She glanced at him. "I'm not building a life with them, Amara. I'm building it with you." And just like that, the storm that had been quietly brewing within her stilled, not vanished, but no longer feared. Because he saw her now, not just the woman he'd fallen for, but the woman who fought to stay standing. And he didn't flinch. Not anymore. The baby kicked later that night for the first time. It was subtle, a flutter, like a heartbeat trapped inside her belly. Amara gasped, hand flying to her stomach. Ethan turned. "What is it?" She took his hand and pressed it gently against the spot. They both waited. And there it was. A second kick. A spark in the dark. He looked at her, eyes wide, unguarded. "That was real," she whispered. And in that quiet, suspended moment, something else settled between them. Not just hope, not just love, but fire, burning softly beneath the surface, lighting the road ahead. Together. The days folded into each other like linen sheets, quiet, warm, and fragile. In the cocoon of their home, Amara moved differently now. Her steps were slow, not from weakness, but from a deepening awareness of everything her body held. The rhythm of her days no longer followed the world's urgency, but the quiet pulse of new life blooming inside her. Ethan noticed the change. She had become softer and firmer, as if the child she carried had rewritten her bones with gentleness and steel. He caught her sometimes in the reflection of the nursery mirror, holding her belly and whispering words too quiet for him to hear. And he never interrupted. He watched, memorizing the curve of her hands, the bend in her smile, the hush in her eyes. Winter had tightened its grip outside, but the air grew warmer with anticipation inside the penthouse. It was a Friday morning when the conversation began. She was sitting on the edge of their bed, a soft robe wrapping her like fog, a mug of tea cupped in her palms. Ethan sat across from her, tie half knotted, briefcase open but forgotten on the chair beside him. "Have you thought about names?" he asked, barely above a murmur. Amara blinked. Names. For the baby. She looked down at her cup, then back at him. "I've thought about everything except that." He leaned in, elbows on his knees. "Why?" A long pause. "The kind that tastes like memory. Because giving something a name means admitting it's real, that it could be taken from me." Her voice was soft, steady, but her eyes held the shadow of an old wound, of losses unspoken and promises never kept. Ethan crossed the room and knelt before her, gently touching her knees. "No one is taking this from you," he said. "Not this time." She didn't answer, but she didn't pull away either. That night, she sat in the nursery with a notebook in her lap. The room smelled like new paint and lavender. The soft light from the corner lamp spilled over the crib, the rocking chair, the shelf where tiny shoes waited without feet. She began to write. Names she remembered from books. Names that reminded her of the women who raised her. Names whispered in churches, in songs, in dreams. But none of them fit. Not quite. She closed her eyes and tried to picture the child. A soft blur, fingers curled, chest rising and falling. And suddenly, a name emerged, not from logic, but from how her heart clenched around it. Eliana. It meant, God has answered. She had read it once in an old Bible from her grandmother, tucked between yellowed pages and a pressed flower. She whispered it aloud. The room held its breath. Yes, that was her. The next morning, Ethan found the notebook on his side of the bed. He turned to the page. Eliana. Beneath it, she had written, "If she has your eyes and my fire, this world will never stand a chance." He smiled, slow, reverent, and tucked the page back between the sheets. That evening, he came home with a small velvet box. No announcement, no performance. Inside was a delicate gold necklace, a single charm, the letter E. Not for him, not for Ethan, but for the name that had already rewritten his world. When he placed it gently around Amara's neck, she didn't speak. She leaned into him, forehead resting against his, the silence complete of breath and belonging. 1 week later, the snow gave way to rain, and with it came the first signs. Amara woke to a dull ache low in her back. It wasn't sharp, just present, like a thread pulling her towards something she couldn't yet see. She said nothing at first. She moved through the morning with care, her hands resting on counters a little longer, her breaths held a little deeper. Ethan noticed, of course. He always did. "You're breathing like you're in labor," he said softly, half joking, half terrified. "I'm not," she said, though the way she gripped the edge of the sink said otherwise. It was noon when the pain sharpened. By 2, her breath was catching. By 5, they were at the hospital. The world became a blur of fluorescent lights, rushing steps, and monitors beeping like coded lullabies. Ethan never left her side. He whispered between contractions, wiped her brow, and kissed her knuckles. And when the pain stole her words, she looked at him, and that look said everything. "Please don't leave me. I'm right here." Hours passed like seconds and centuries, until finally, the room shifted. The cries were sharp, new, sacred. And then, Eliana was there, wrinkled and red, and impossibly small. A miracle made flesh. They placed her in Amara's arms, and the world stilled. Amara stared down at her daughter, heart aching in ways she hadn't known were possible. "She looks like you," Ethan whispered. "No," Amara said, brushing a trembling finger across Eliana's cheek. "She looks like hope." Tears filled Ethan's eyes, not because he was overwhelmed, but for the first time, he understood what love meant. Not power, not controlled, not legacy, but the quiet promise to never let go. Later that night, when the nurses had gone and the room had settled into darkness, Amara lay with Eliana cradled on her chest, and Ethan beside them, one hand resting on both their hearts. He watched the rise and fall of their breath, his world now so small and yet infinite. "She's going to change everything," Amara murmured. "She already has," he said. And in that moment, there were no secrets, no contracts, no ghosts of past pain, only the rhythm of 3 hearts beating in time. And the name that once scared Amara now gave her the strength to believe again. Eliana. Her beginning. Their home. The days after Eliana's birth unfolded like petals in early spring, slow, careful, filled with a silence that wasn't empty, but sacred. The hospital discharged them 3 days later, though the nurse lingered unusually long at the door, smiling at the small bundle in Amara's arms, as if she couldn't quite believe such a tiny life could carry so much light. Amara, too, had changed. She wasn't just a mother now. She was something else. Calmer, but fiercer. Her voice lower, her movements surer. She had gone through the fire, and something within her had emerged forged and new. Ethan noticed it. He saw it in how she cradled Eliana, speaking to her in a hush that sounded almost like music. She no longer looked at herself in the mirror, as if she were surviving. Now she was becoming. Their once cavernous and cold home was now pulsing with the small chaos of new life. Bottles are drying on the counter. Baby blankets are draped across designer armchairs. Soft lullabies played from a Bluetooth speaker in the nursery, often interrupted by Eliana's shrill but endearing cries. And in all of this, Ethan changed too. The man who once ruled meetings with a gaze that chilled boardrooms now found himself learning the perfect temperature for formula, fumbling with onesies that made no logical sense, and waking, without complaint, at 3 a.m. to watch his daughter sleep. He didn't always understand her cries, but he understood her presence. She anchored him in a way no billion-dollar deal ever could. It was a quiet afternoon when the past returned, uninvited. Amara had just put Eliana down for a nap, her breathing steady and rhythmic against the white noise of rain outside. She entered the living room to find Ethan sitting on the sofa, his jaw tight, a printed document trembling slightly in his hands. She knew that look, the controlled fury beneath stillness. She'd seen it only twice before. "What is it?" she asked, her voice soft. He looked up, those ice-blue eyes darker than usual. He handed her the paper. At the top, a leaked tabloid article. The Billionaire's Mistress or Muse. An insider's look at Ethan Whitmore's latest charity case. Her photo was splashed beneath the headline. Not one from the gala, but one from years ago. Her old neighborhood, when she scrubbed floors for less than minimum wage. A captured moment, her in a hoodie and braids, holding a paper bag of groceries. The caption beneath twisted her into a narrative she'd spent her whole life outrunning. She stared at it for a long moment, not blinking. "Who leaked this?" she finally asked. "Does it matter?" he growled. "The damage is the same." "Not to me," she said, laying the paper down slowly. "I'm used to being misunderstood." Ethan stood, the storm rising in him. "They called you a project, a public image stunt. They called our daughter an afterthought." Amara reached for his hand. He was trembling. "They want you angry," she said gently. "They want to reduce you to fury because they can't comprehend love without leverage. But you shouldn't have to carry this. We shouldn't have to." She smiled faintly. "I carried a child for 9 months, Ethan. I think I can carry a few opinions." There was a silence between them, thick but not heavy. "I don't care what they think," she continued, voice steady. "But I care what we build." He looked at her, and something softened. Because she didn't need defending. She required partnership. And he was learning to give that, day by day. A week later, the backlash had faded into static. Because something else replaced it. Something no one could twist or reframe. The Whitmore Foundation, long known for its elite boardrooms and sterile campaigns, announced its new initiative. A maternal health program specifically focused on underserved Black communities. It wasn't branded as Ethan's gesture. It wasn't tied to the press. It wasn't loud. But it was real. It was Amara's vision. And Ethan funded it with the passion usually reserved for his corporate takeovers. Not to prove something, but to honor her strength. When asked in a rare interview what inspired the pivot, Ethan replied, "She changed what I thought power looked like." On Eliana's first outing, a small park tucked behind a cathedral in the village, Amara sat on a bench in the golden light of late afternoon, her daughter sleeping against her chest. The air smelled like leaves and possibility. Ethan sat beside them, silent for a while. Then, unprompted, he said, "I thought I knew what love was." She turned slightly. He was staring ahead, eyes soft but distant. "I thought it was control, mastery, something earned or traded. But then you walked into my office that morning, and suddenly, none of that made sense anymore." Amara didn't interrupt. He continued, "I fought it. I tried to reduce it to logic, a contract, a plan. But it kept outgrowing the box I tried to put it in. You did." She looked at him, truly looked, and saw not the billionaire, not the myth, but the man, vulnerable, rewritten. "I didn't know what love was either," she whispered, "not the kind that stays." They sat like that for a while, surrounded by the low hum of the city. Then, quietly, he took a small box from his coat pocket, opened it. Not a diamond, not a showpiece. Inside, a simple silver band with 3 etched lines across its surface. "For you," he said. "One for your strength, one for your grace, one for everything you gave me without asking for anything back." Amara didn't say yes. She didn't need to. She slid the ring on her finger and leaned into him, Eliana between them, asleep beneath the sky. And in that breath of silence, the story found its shape. Not a fairy tale, not a rescue, but a love forged not from perfection, but from truth, tested by fire, and still standing, together. It had been nearly 3 years since Amara walked into Ethan's office the first night, eyes wary, voice firm, spine straightened by survival. Back then, she hadn't come for love. She'd come for a lifeline. And he, behind his sleek desk and sharper gaze, hadn't believed in anything soft or sacred. He believed in transactions. Yet here they were now, in a home with walls full of laughter, a backyard scattered with toys, and a daughter whose first word had been light. They'd built something money couldn't blueprint, and no headline could reduce. Amara stood barefoot in the kitchen, flour on her hands, braids pulled into a loose bun. Through the wide-open patio doors, she could hear Eliana giggling in the garden, chasing bubbles. Ethan's voice followed, deep, amused, clumsy, in the way only fathers could be when trying to be superheroes on grass. Amara smiled as she wiped her hands on a dish towel and leaned against the doorframe. She didn't interrupt them. She didn't need to. This quiet, this chaos, was everything she never knew to ask for. A soft breeze stirred the curtains behind her, and for a second, she thought back to the version of herself who once slept with worry in her chest and dreams too fragile to speak aloud. Would that girl even recognize this life? Maybe not. But she'd be proud of how far they'd come, of how much they'd unlearned, forgiven, and rebuilt, not just with each other, but within themselves. That evening, after the sun had dipped behind the hills and Eliana had finally drifted off in her sea of plush animals, Amara and Ethan sat on the porch swing beneath the golden hue of hanging lanterns. The silence between them was complete, not empty. It held history, grace, breath. Ethan reached for her hand. "I was afraid," he murmured. "Of what?" she asked softly. "That I'd ruin you. That I'd hurt you the way men like me always do." Amara looked at him, her thumb tracing the back of his knuckles. "But you didn't," she said. "You didn't run. You stayed. You grew." He laughed lightly. "Only because you left me no choice." She leaned her head on his shoulder. "That's love. It changes the terms." In the years that followed, the world kept spinning. The Whitmore Foundation grew, now run by Amara, whose sharp mind and unshakable compassion transformed it from a philanthropic brand into a lifeline for thousands. Clinics, shelters, scholarships, all grounded in a mission born not from pity, but from experience. Ethan stepped back from headlines and power tables. He still held influence, yes, but he wielded it differently now, with intention, with care, with her beside him. And every evening, no matter how long the day, he came home to the same warmth. Eliana's tiny feet thudded down the hall, Amara's smile from the kitchen, and the quiet hum of a home that felt nothing like the cold penthouses he once mistook for meaning. One summer afternoon, Eliana, now 5 and wildly curious, sat on the front steps with Amara. "Mommy, why did you choose Daddy?" she asked, eyes wide. Amara paused. There were 1,000 answers. Because he listened, eventually. Because he let me be soft without losing my edge. Because he stood still when I was falling apart. But instead, she just said, "Because he chose us back." Eliana smiled and rested her head on her mother's lap, as if the answer made sense in her tiny world. Maybe it did. Some stories begin with fairy tales. Others begin with fires. But the ones that last, they grow slowly, patiently, with cracks and glue and hands reaching through the dark. This was one of those. Not perfect, but real. The kind that doesn't ask for applause. Only presence. Only breathe. Only love. And if you've made it this far in their story, if you've felt the ache, the healing, the laughter between the lines, then maybe, just maybe, you believe it too. That love can begin in the unlikeliest of places. That two people from opposite worlds can meet not just in desire, but in choice. That redemption is not just for fairy tales, but for the ordinary and extraordinary alike. Thank you for walking through every page of Amara and Ethan's journey. If their story touched your heart or made you think, feel, or believe again, don't forget to like, comment, and follow the channel. Because somewhere out there, someone else needs to know that love, when it's real, doesn't ask for perfection. It only asks that you stay and build something worth staying for.